All right. Welcome everyone. My name is Tobani, and today we are honored to have Professor Xavier Livermon, as well as Vusumzi Nkomo, to discuss this important book, Kwaito Bodies. When we had the discussion around the format of the talk, we decided that instead of me doing a traditional introduction, we're going to actually allow the speakers to actually share their own journeys, not only with the book, but certainly their own work around popular cultures and so on. So without wasting any more time, I will hand over to Vusi, who will not only act as a respondent of sort, but also the moderator for the conversation. So over to you, Vusi.
I think it's off. Good afternoon, and thank you to Kobani for having me. Well, good morning to Xavier. I've just had quite a long one, so I'll try and keep up as much as possible. But my name is Vusi, short for Vusumzi. I'm a writer, primarily writing is my primary medium, but also overall art media practitioner, educator, and political organizer. I'm currently spending most of my time teaching at two institutions, teaching mostly introduction to Black studies stuff, that kind of cool stuff, thinking about Black people as they navigate the world, as they resist and rupture everyday forms of anti-Blackness, but at the same time doing so culturally, aesthetically, artistically, and otherwise. I'm also an avid reader. I love books. Guess that's why we're here. And I also full-time, sometimes part-time, head researcher and editing a young critical journal called iLiso magazine. We've been recently interrogating Black people's relations to space and geography and landscapes and architecture, producing quite beautiful work. That I think is quite impressive. Over to you, Prof.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. First of all, thank you, Obani, for the invitation. Also to UJ's Department of Anthro and folks kind of engaged in Gauteng Anthropology. I also want to thank you, Vusi, for just your engagement with the work. You're sort of very generous. And critical feedback on the work has been really great for me, and I'm looking forward to hearing more of what you have to say about the text. And just thanking all of you for joining today. I think the easiest way for me to kind of describe my journey is that I grew up not necessarily thinking that I was going to be any kind of academic, but I became really interested in Black studies, actually, in many ways, and trying to think about what are these sort of relations that happen between folks around the world who are Black, right? And what are the kinds of exchanges and the forms of solidarity that can connect them. And that kind of led me to, studying and being really interested in popular music, because I saw that as a space for certain kinds of vernacular forms of connection that couldn't necessarily be captured by a lot of more traditional social science, literature and background. And so when I came to South Africa for the first time, which was in '95, I was sort of immediately hit with just what Kwaito was as a culture for people, or what Kwaito is as a culture for people. And I saw some really interesting resonance with things that were happening across the Black world. And I ran away from the topic for a really long time, and kind of ran away from me as a researcher as well, which I'll talk about a little bit. And but ultimately kind of realized that if I was going to do a dissertation, I needed to do a dissertation about something that I loved, and something that moved me. And that's how I really started getting into researching and writing about Kwaito. So that's kind of been, so I feel like my journey has always been about kind of the navigation of that space between, South Africa and the United States, between Black people globally. I tell people I kind of live at the hyphen between African American, and that's kind of how I sort of approached. That was one of the main frameworks through which I approached the study of Kwaito. So currently, I teach at UC Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, in the feminist studies department, and I'm also in a program called Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. So if you do need to reach out to me, you can kind of find me by just kind of Googling my name and UC Santa Cruz, and I'm happy to continue the conversation after today. So I'm done now.
So I don't know, do I just go or?
Yes, absolutely. The stage is yours.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think this is my first time moderating anything, so bear with me. Or co-moderating anything. Cool. I mean, I think as an entry point to the work, so how I got into the book itself, Kobani gifted me with a copy, and with my interest in in performance, Afro-diasporic music, and I was just, yeah, I mean, I was just blown away by certain things that I also try and touch on, and also had my own reservations about the work as well, which I was, I mean, privileged enough to have access to the work, but at the same time, is there an issue with sound?
No, there isn't. We can hear you perfectly.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to try to help the person privately.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah. So I guess as a entry point to the work, there's a short thing that I was able to write, as just trying to gather some of the thoughts, some of the highlights from engaging with the work, into like a couple of sentences. I think I could just maybe just read that and then just go through what I'm thinking now, which isn't so further removed from what I was thinking at the point of writing. But I guess also it can also serve as an introduction into the book itself, but at least from my voice. And Xavier is welcome to contest if he feels like there's a misrepresentation in the description. So I felt that Kwaito Bodies is an ethnographic study of Kwaito, the music genre and culture, born in Johannesburg and based on a fieldwork conducted in Jozi by the author. The book deploys Black, queer, and feminist theory as the primary analytic lenses through which to think about how Kwaito challenged constructions of gender and sexuality, how prominent Kwaito has reconfigured these normative strictures in an impressively performative fashion. Kwaito is productively positioned within the cartography and genealogy of Black cultural production and the African diaspora, whose sonic, sartorial, political, and performative traditions influence its foundations and give impetus to its most groundbreaking moments. We are drawn into a critique of Kwaito as it emerges and develops alongside very specific political and historical developments, from late apartheid uncertainty, the triumph of global capitalism, neoliberal paradigm over the Soviet Union, and the Rainbow Nation, only to be dragged back to the destruction of Sophiatown. Key to this lifelong study are generative concepts like melancholic conviviality, cultural trauma, remastering, Kwaito bodies, and Afro-diasporic space. So, yeah, I mean, that was pretty much what I wanted to read. And just to share a few points regarding that, or maybe first as a reflection on that, what I was really thinking when I sort of penned down that, but what I'm at now in thinking about the work. There was a thing that I've shared with a few friends before, and I'd be keen to hear from Xavier about this. That I felt was a sort of salient feature throughout. People were engaging formally and informally, with Kwaito. There's a kind of there's a way in which the work is always centered around Johannesburg, right? And I guess there are reasons to that. But at the same time, sort of Jaws centric. I've been feeling that has robbed us of an opportunity to study other parts or sides of the country, where people were engaged in practice of producing this cultural form that isn't Johannesburg, right? And I think then, even as the book also alludes to some of those smaller incidents, right? Talking about the immigrant encounters, also making examples of, the group that Beyonce worked with, having, been from a small village. But at the time, I felt some of the study into this art form in the country is very Joseph-centric, and I'd be interested to hear, Xavier's responses to that and what he makes of that. Understanding that, he was speaking, because it also deploys a kind of auto theory, right, in his interrogation, as a method in his interrogation of the work, which, almost makes it, makes it easy for him to respond to his immediate setting, which was Johannesburg when he was resident of that city. But I'm interested in whether we can entertain the possibility of, producing work around Kwaito that is not Johannesburg, and what that conversation would entail, I guess. But anyways, yeah, that would be the first thing that I wanted to just get out of the way. But I also want to talk about, have a chat about the supposed apolitical nature of the early Kwaito practitioners, right? That is also just not apolitical at all. I was reading an article recently, or this morning actually, by Njabulo Mzwane, who just put out an article on Made in Guardian. I believe it's part of the people here, where he called it, alternative sociality, and I found that to be quite interesting. I think as an interrogation into the supposed apolitical nature of the art form that really isn't apolitical, but also there's certain forms of erasure that also preoccupy the author in the book. I think there are quite a few, but the forms of erasure that that the author is also interested in, that I also found interesting in my there's an erasure of queer practitioners, right, or queer participants in the discussion around this art form and this cultural art form that is Kwaito. I'd also like to hear some more from you, Xavier. What sort of got you to interrogate this erasure? But secondly, he also mentions that there's an erasure of the fans' enjoyment of the work, and I felt this is quite important and quite productive to interrogate, the ways in which we've not paid attention to, in a sort of formal way, have not paid attention to the erasures of how people enjoyed the thing. And it got me thinking of Sadia Hartman and Frank Alderson's article or interview, The Position of the Unthought, when they talk about this idea of enjoyment, and how Black people are not only robbed of the things that they do, but they're also robbed of the capacity to enjoy the things that they do. And I think this erasure has something to do with that phenomenon, which is quite historic. But also thinking about how Black cultural production, because it comes from people who already constitute a profound threat to society. All cultural productions all Black cultural productions seem to, even if they don't articulate it, but also they seem to be received as a sort of profound threat You know, I mean, therefore, it's not accidental that even political figures, early 90s, sort of coded Kwaito, you know, as a distraction to nation building, to coercion, as an obsession with, you know, with Tagare, as an obsession with the bling bling, decadent, you know, black sociality. But it's important to think about, you know, this dismissal within that context, you know, of black people as a group of people that you know automatically constitute a profound threat to society or profound threat to normative social order, right? And I think, you know, the book sort of does allude to that question. But you know, also even in the way in which, you know, Luke Gordon speaks about this idea that, you know, this idea of not only because black people constitute a problem, right, a collective problem. Therefore, the things that, you know, that they produce, they're not immediately thought of as art. You know, it's always something else before it becomes art. You know, and I can't think of many things that we produce at a sort of cultural plane, artistic plane, that are immediately received as such, you know, and afforded that kind of respect as well. Yeah, anyways, yeah, that would be another set of, I don't know how I'm doing for time. Quite a lot. But yeah, I mean, yeah.
Let's say 5 more minutes.
5 more. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I don't know, I can just throw questions at you, Xavier. Not necessarily questions, but things that I also think I'd like you to touch on. You described, there's something that you described as a forum for feminine agency. And I mean, the phrase is quite interesting, but I was also drawn to the word forum, you know, as a sort of mode and technique of gathering or assembly, you know, sort of constitutes study on its own, right? But forum, I'm not to say all forums are political, you know, but there's a way in which this feminist gathering, you know, this form of gathering within that space, sort of Afro-diasporic space or Afro-diasporic entanglements, you know, this forum itself is in some way, or at least you argue in some way, sort of subversive practice. You know, but I wanted to hear you speak a bit about, you know, the reason to think of this feminine agents as a forum, and whether, you know, the word was accidental or whether how intentional were you in deploying that word as a mode of gathering, as a mode of assembly. I'm interested in that kind of work, and obviously, you know, speak a bit about the range of queer practitioners. But I mean, in our last chat, we spoke a bit also about the minibus as quite central to the dissemination of the work, the dissemination of, you know, the cultural product itself. And I felt it was quite generative to deploy the minibus, taxi, you know, in that kind of way, you know, not only as a mode of transport, but as important in putting the work everywhere. Firstly, but secondly, as a space, the minibus taxi as a space for, you know, for critically engaging with the work, you know, yeah, and also just speak a bit about the reason to speak from the South, deploying auto theory as a method, and whether what other complications were possibly arise out of that. I mean, you don't necessarily code it as auto theory, but, you know, auto theory being this idea of centering the body as a primary site of critique, right? And I think it's interesting how then you know, we would think about holding the person writing accountable, you know, when they sort of position themselves in that kind of way, and whether as someone who, quote unquote, outsider, you know, what are the complications that would arise out of that, you know, and yeah, I think I can stop there for now. Yeah, I don't know where you want to start.
Yeah. Thank you for all of that. I will try to kind of do my best to address these sets of provocations that I find really generative, and I may ask you to remind me of a few of them along the way as I kind of discuss. So I'm really I guess I'll start a little, let's maybe work our way backwards, maybe. And I'll kind of start with this question of auto theory, or what some folks would call autoethnography, right, as a kind of methodological format, and then how that gets complicated by the sort of outsider status that I have. I think two things. I try to think about. I wasn't necessarily trained in ethnography specifically, right? And I went into the work not necessarily knowing that I would use some kind of ethnographic methods, but not sure which ones, right? And so I kind of went through a whole bunch of different ones. And this gets back to what I said about running away from myself in the work. There was a lot of me trying to maintain a certain level of detachment and ostensible scholarly objectivity that, as I continued to do more feminist and queer readings and also readings in Black studies, I kind of realized that that a lot of that is a way, I think, for us to not be able to bring different kinds of Black knowledges or epistemologies to bear on the work. And so I knew that I needed to think of a way to think about, well, if I'm approaching this research, I am not, there's aspects of this research that are going to be informed by who I am and how I'm positioned. And I think rather than hiding that behind a sort of methodological sleight of hand, right, it would be better to actually kind of expose those relations, right? And that was a part of a really sincere attempt on my part to engage this as a critical ethnography, which is meant to, on the one hand, really account for the politics as much as possible of doing the work. And I knew that I, as a researcher, was going to have access to different kinds of information because of who I was. But on the other hand, I also would interpret that information differently because of who I was. And I wanted those stakes to be as explicit and transparent as possible. And so that's really where the notions of auto theory that you're speaking about really came from. I will say that the tradition that I was sort of accessing is the tradition of sort of performance ethnography, which kind of comes out of that engagement between theater and anthropology traditionally. And I pushed it a little bit because I took very seriously the idea of performance in everyday life, right? So in some ways, like, the book is not a traditional performance ethnography in the sense that I'm not a musician, making music with other musicians and then analyzing that music that we make. Like, I'm not doing that kind of performance ethnography. But I felt that framework allowed me to weave in the sort of discursive media cultural studies analyses on the one hand and the sort of ethnographic engagement on the other. And I think the other thing that I was excited about with performance ethnography as a methodology was the way that performance ethnography sort of encourages you to think about encourages you to really think about creating the work constitutively with the people that you are working with, right? Rather than kind of, being outside of it, right? And so the idea there, I think, was also a way to kind of, to speak about the fact that this was a co-creative project in many ways with my interlocutors, right? And to kind of try to acknowledge that as much as possible. So I think that's where the insertions of myself in the text were coming from, and why they were deployed. And I tried to do my best to stick within a sort of critical ethnographic tradition so that it didn't devolve into a sort of kind of navel gazing, kind of thing that I think some of that can be. Acknowledging then, of course, that there are limits to that, because as I think there would be limits to any researcher's capacity but that there are limits to that. And I think that, and I don't know, I think about even when I do research in the US, right? I'm not exactly the same, right? Just due to being a scholar and the way that I'm positioned as the communities that I study. So I think we all kind of engage in varying different degrees of outsider insiderness in relationship to our work. And I felt that auto theory helped to also explicate that a little bit, that tension. So you asked about, oh yes, the term forum. So I don't know if it was intentional in the sense of like picking the word forum, but I wanted something that spoke to, but they did speak to this notion of a sort of gathering or an assembly that wasn't, that both could have physical components and but also be these kinds of spaces of thought, right? Or forms of imagination of connections, right? That I thought was important. And so I didn't quite think of the importance of the word at the time that I'm writing, but I also don't think it was entirely random, right? I think I was trying to access this idea of spaces of, and probably I would use the word femme now rather than feminine if I had to go back and write the book over again. But spaces of kind of, I think, femme autonomy and enjoyment and possibility, right? That I wanted to be able to kind of speak about. And I think that's where and I think that there's an element, speaking about your discussion about dismissal. I think there's an element in what I was trying to do that was definitely somewhat vindicationalist, although I didn't make the book about trying to kind of rescue, the cultural form, but I didn't want it to be about responding to critics of the form, but in a way it is, right? Like, and I just felt that when I was coming to South Africa and I was reading what I was reading in the newspapers, and what I was experiencing when I was in the clubs with people and parties with people moving through everyday lives were just so distinct and separate, that I kind of wanted to account for. I wanted to try to think about, well, why is all of this energy being galvanized against this popular cultural form, right? Why is it being talked about in this way? Why are the people who produce it being spoken about in this way, right? And that kind of, began a lot of my real interest in thinking about the ways that Black people and the art that they produce tends to be perceived as a threat in various different kinds of ways, just because of who's doing it, right? And so I definitely wanted to speak about that. And I think along those lines, when I think about the queer aspects, of what I was trying to get at in the work, I think that comes once again from the sort of I think from my shift of kind of running away from my own body and my embodiment as a researcher to embracing it, right? And so therefore sort of embracing my own location as a queer person, but also acknowledging that wherever I might have ended up in my Kwaito journey, that journey was initiated oftentimes by a Black queer South African in some way, right? I wouldn't have been in the space. I wouldn't have been able to access what I was able to access if it wasn't for the Black queer people who gave me that access, right? And so I think that I started to think about, well, what does it mean when people are enjoying something that's been labeled as sort of masculinist, misogynist, and homophobic? And of course, these debates have happened in other musical genres as well. But I wanted to be able to kind of speak about the specificity of how I saw that debate unfolding in the sort of South African context. And so that was really where I realized that I needed to take a feminist and queer lens to this conversation, because it was the only way for me to be true to the methodological practice that I had created, right? And then of course these are political decisions as well, right? When you're making these decisions. So it was also a way about assigning a certain kind of politics to the work, right? And wanting to ground the work in a feminist and queer analysis to the extent that I could, right? Without, I think without trying to over imagine, I guess, the possibilities for queerness and femme centricity, right? But then also acknowledging that the contradictory nature of the cultural formation that in many ways is very heteromasculine, but on the other hand, also clearly provided spaces for people who were not that to be able to kind of imagine themselves, their gender, their sexuality, performances in different ways.
Can I ask something before?
Yeah.
Just on the point, there's an interesting concept that you mentioned, misrecognition.
Yes.
Can you, I mean, in sort of elaborating on this point of embodied performance and, you know, the black queer community allowing you space to be there. When did you pick up this idea of misrecognition in that context, if I'm making any sense?
Yeah, no, you are. I mean, I think it was a set of ideas that had been with me like in my heart, but I didn't have a language for being able to name what it was that I felt that I was experiencing, right? And I wanted to try to also write the story of diasporic engagement with Africa in a different way. You know, I felt like that story always gets written as in a very romantic manner, or in a manner that that always seems to either end up in a space of critical disappointment, right? Or some sense of irrevocable or irrecoverable loss. And those narratives are important. Like I'm not dismissing anyone's work, but I wanted to, I guess this gets me back to my desire to talk about how despite that you can, there were so many moments of friendship and love and solidarity and care for one another that was also happening, right, across these supposedly intractable lines, right? And so I think that's what I would kind of, I'm sorry, I kind of forgot the original question really quickly again.
No, I just wanted to get a sense of the concept of misrecognition.
Yes. So thank you. So
maybe just explain it a bit if you don't mind. Yeah. Maybe just like explain it a bit.
Yeah. So for me, misrecognition was about these ways in which either people were, it was a way of thinking about the ways in which you were both included in something because people were assuming that you were something, or excluded for something because people were assuming that you were something, right? And it was about these moments of maybe to these moments of just being I don't know, not recognized for who I was, but then also being kind of really comfortable with that, and right, and thinking about that as a space as something that was productive rather than something that was scary or should be avoided, right? But that the and then I thought about it, and then I was able to kind of find research that spoke to that conversation, right? And kind of actually went as far as to say that misrecognition is kind of the way of diaspora in many ways, right? And so I wanted to just be able to talk about that combination of recognition and lack of recognition. And so misrecognition was kind of the way that I felt like certain kinds of affinities were being made possible and impossible simultaneously. let me see what else I wanted to talk about. That I talked about the queer. Oh, so you asked me about the Josie centricity of the work. Yeah. And I even wonder if, like, retrospectively, I would have just taken South Africa out of the title and just put Josie, right? Now that I'm thinking about it, right? I will say it was never my intention for Josie to be a stand-in for the entire nation, right? But a lot of that was about what I was able to find as a researcher, right? I found that trying to engage, I think initially I had imagined this as a project that focused a lot more on artists and the industry than what it actually became, right? So if I think about how I went into the field work and then how I left it, there's a practical 180-degree turn, right? Because the text really becomes more about the fans and their consumption and enjoyment, and less about the industry and the artists making the work, right? But I didn't go into it with that. So I think that I started trying to do research actually outside of Johannesburg initially, and then at a certain point I was like, I don't think this is going to work unless I get myself to Josie and start working there. And so that's honestly where it came from as far as like my own personal journey, right? Was sort of me situating myself in and also finding how can I say this? Finding in Josie also like a welcome, right? And a sort of openness, I think, to me and what I was doing that maybe I wasn't seeing in some other spaces that I was trying to operate in. So it was also just like, oh, okay, well, I'm getting invited to things, and I'm actually able to do the field work. It felt like a lot easier. I gesture towards other geographic spaces, but I definitely think that this project looks different, right? If you move to even different urban areas, much less a consideration of the rural or other parts of the country. And so I invite, kind of trying to think critically about what that spatiality looks like and how it changes the work, right? And I will say that I think my recognition of Josie as a particular space of social and geographic and historical significance kind of led me to the chapter that kind of was my attempt at urban geography, right? I'm not sure if it's actually was pulled off, although some geographers have given me really good feedback on it. But that's in some ways where that second chapter really came from, was for me wanting to account for the particular sociogeography of Josie. And so much of my life was spent in minibus taxis, and as a result, I saw the taxi as this sort of space for so much kind of debate and politics and conversation, and also the enactment of certain kinds of things. And I know for me, a lot of times I was discovering the best songs or the latest songs because I was riding in a taxi, right? And so I wanted to incorporate that into the work, and I wanted to try to think about it as a sort of social, mobile, embodied space, right? That then could do certain kinds of work. So much of what happens in this text is about me at some point recognizing, coming to terms with and recognizing my embodiment as a researcher, and then how that therefore influences the work, and then trying to be as transparent as possible about that in the writing of the work. And I'm sorry, I saw a question, but I don't know how to bring it back up.
We can read it to you.
Okay.
No, I was gonna ask, I don't know what's the format. Maybe we pack them to later, or we want to just go into them now. I don't know. I'm open for whatever.
It's up to you too. So whenever you're ready to do Q&A,
because of I saw some. Oh, sorry, Doug.
No, sorry, I was saying whenever you both are ready, feel free to just immediately go to Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
No, I was going to say, because I sort of posed some discussion points, maybe you'd want to just go through that and then we pack them when you feel like you've answered sufficiently whatever you heard from me. Yeah.
Okay, that works for me. We can kind of take those at the end. So yeah, I think that's what I would say. And then you talked a lot about pleasure, right? And that was really important to me. I just, and I think this is just sort of the larger aspect of my work. If there's anything that I could say is kind of an oeuvre of my work going across the whole thing, or a sort of tenet or affect of my work, it's around pleasure. I just kind of, I want to write about Black people loving their bodies and having pleasure and in enjoyment, right? I really wanted to think about that, you know, the ecstatic aspects of Blackness, right? And yeah, that was, and I felt that it was also a way to counterpoint, as I said, what I felt were some of the really stultified and kind of caricatured ways that Kwaito had been spoken about. I really wanted to get at, well, if this, you know, people are clearly enjoying themselves, right, while they're engaging in this musical culture, in this cultural formation. So why is so little about the writing about the ways in which people are enjoying themselves, right? And I felt like to the extent that it was engaged, it was always engaged somewhat dismissively, right, as a kind of example of the distraction and excess of kind of the youth, right? Rather than as an idea that there's something political and important about joy that even is beyond a kind of or that moves beyond a kind of notion of joy as sort of a respite from sort of everyday life, right? But rather thinking about how joy gets incorporated into everyday lives. And I wanted to talk about these moments of the spectacular, right? But also these sort of quiet everyday moments as well. And I was trying to have both of that in the text. But for me, being able to talk about forms of Black pleasure and Black joy was really, really critical to this study, and to kind of think about it that way, which I tried to do that without being overly romantic or overly celebratory, like understanding the limits of what this Black joy and pleasure can contain, right? But also just being really critical about wanting to encapsulate that in the work. So I think that was what was really important to me. And I think in some ways, once again, that's drawn from a Black feminist analytic, as far as, you know, being important for me to be able to talk about. And I think also to see cultural production as an alternative space for theorizing and for analysis, right? I think which is also a sort of, for me, like, you know, a Black feminist, if I'm thinking about, you know, the ways that Barbara Christian told us that, you know, Black people often theorize in the narrative, right, through storytelling and through, you know, sort of various different kinds of artistic practices. And I wanted to be able to latch on to that kind of theorizing. I think, I'm sure I have forgotten some of the things that you've mentioned, so we can obviously go back to anything if I've skipped over something. I just really want to quickly talk about remastery and Afro-diasporic space just very briefly. For me, remastery was just a way for me to think about the incompleteness of transformation, right? And the processual nature of the change from apartheid to post-apartheid, right? That it was still in process. It wasn't just a sort of fiat moment that, okay, 1994 comes, there's a election, and now you know, and so now it's everything's good, right? And so the idea was informed both by post-colonial theory and as well as sort of Afro diasporic theory from the Caribbean and the US, right? So this notion of mastery and remastery was sort of coming from these ideas of how do you talk about the change that doesn't feel always like a major change, right? Or how do you talk about what are the possibilities and hopes and dreams and so forth that are still happening within a certain constraint, right? So I thought that remastery allowed me to think about what can happen within those realms of constraint, but also be mindful of the kinds of constraints that were being imposed. And then Afro diasporic space was a way for me to think about. I felt like there were a lot of debates around Kwaito that talked about it as sort of imitative and, you know, and not South African enough in some ways, right? Even as it was so quintessentially South African, right? And I wanted to be able to speak about what I saw as this sort of really long history of cultural exchange between Black South Africans and Black people elsewhere, including the African continent, including, you know, on both sides of the Atlantic, right? That this was not something that just started happening when Kwaito music was being produced, but rather had this longer genealogy, right? And then as I began to kind of look back into that longer genealogy, I knew that diaspora had to come into the conversation, but I didn't want it to be the kind of US framework for diaspora, right? Or even maybe the Black British framework. I wanted to try to think of something that would kind of start with South Africa as the kind of way of thinking about what those diasporic relations could look like. And so, you know, Afro diasporic space was my attempt to kind of deal both with my personal embodiment as a diasporic person experiencing the space, right? So but also as a way to kind of theorize the gestures and of Black South Africans towards other spaces of Blackness globally, right? And particularly within forms of cultural production. So I think if there's anything I've missed, I'm happy to revisit. But I think that's kind of, I think, a good summary of your provocations, and thank you so much for them.
Yeah, I think just to, I mean, what I liked is there were certain things that I wanted to ask, but you sort of just touched on, like remastery, not to ask, but just to get you to maybe explain a bit. But there was a thing that, you know, that I was also just, you know, wrestling with, the deployment of the word body, right? Or as bodies as it relates to Black people, right? So there is a kind of, I mean, because I use the word quite a lot in my own writing as well, right? So there is a kind of what I call an anti-identity politics kind of sentiment, where the speaking about Black people as bodies, you know, is a kind of can also be thought of as reducing Black people into flesh, right? Also rather like, you know, a collective of flesh or bodies. So it's like, you know, how people are interested in Black studies are also just now being accused of, you know, dehumanizing Black people by reducing them to bodies, you know. And I've always felt you know, a book then that carries this word, you know, bodies, would maybe receive the same backlash that I've also personally received for using the word bodies, you know. I don't know if it was a kind of backlash that you also received, and maybe prior to deciding on that, you know, on that word. I mean, you could have used other words, you know, but to decide on it, you know, in what ways are you sort of anticipating that backlash?
Thank you for bringing that up, actually. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine in some ways, because I do think people see bodies in the title and then think that it's accessing a particular kind of genealogy. primarily connected with, the work of Gordon and social death, and then how that gets taken up in sort of the Wilderson et al. Framing of afropessimism, right? So I think part of what I would like to sort of say with that is that for me, the idea of bodies came out of embodiment, right? And so it was absolutely situated in performance studies and certain kinds of cultural studies, ideas of the body as a space for talking about the material and discursive simultaneously, right? So that was really the idea behind it. I was really accessing a cultural studies tradition and a performance studies tradition. And I came up with the idea like in the mid-aughts, and I didn't necessarily anticipate the way that that particular language of bodies divorced from embodiment, right? Divorced from embodiment, and refiltered as a sort of overarching totalizing theory of Black ontology, right, if we want to call it that, or Black experience, would come to kind of mean this thing. So I do think that for me, when I think about Black bodies, I think about it as a framework that is rooted in the ways that Black performance theorists were trying to make use of both the sort of material and discursive things that are put onto Black people. So like there's a Black body, right? And the sort of embodied interactions of Black people in performance, to push back against those things. And so the representational and the material kind of coming together in this framework of the Black body, right? And that was really the tradition that I was drawing from. I had no idea that it would become kind of this this sort of really important way of talking about structural and systemic, state violence against Black people, particularly, well, state and non-state violence against Black people, right? And that then it would kind of become this thing that people would push back against because it, symbolizes maybe a bit of a reproducing of dehumanization. But of course, to the Afro-pessimist, Black people aren't human. So that would actually, I think for them, they would say, well, precisely our point, right? We're sort of marking that, that this is not a condition of humanity, right? And so, but for me, I really want to reiterate, and I'm happy to discuss this further, that, the tradition and the genealogy that I was accessing had nothing to do with that. It had nothing to do with social death theories. It had nothing to do with Afro-pessimism, and it had nothing to do with notions of death, right? It had everything to do with embodiment, performance, and thinking about the intermingling of the material and the representational. So
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, before I get to my last point, just to comment on that, I was thinking about, especially now when you explain about revisiting that work and also revisiting my own, reflections on the work initially, and thinking about how, I could be guilty of having taken it there, as a form of provocation. And I'm glad that I did. I have no guilty feelings about that.
but sometimes sometimes you need that provocation though. And I think there are actually moments where that framework of Black bodies actually works for the scholarship or for what you're talking.
Yeah, I mean, what allowed me to do that thing, or at least, in me pushing that conversation that way, is, points where you refer to Kwaito ontology, right? Or moments where you talk about practitioners that are putting Kwaito to work, right? And begin to think about Kwaito maybe as a kind of a verb, maybe to Kwaito, as a thing that you would do, the thing that you would engage in. Not necessarily the Kwaito, a Kwaito, but to Kwaito. So maybe a word or two on the decision to think about about Kwaito at that level of ontology, right? To refer to it in that way, pairing with this idea of because when you deploy bodies, then it gives it life, right? Even as people would argue that it dehumanizes dead people, but at the same time, it makes it a thing that lives, right? Because then bodies are on the move, as you also titled one of the, you refer to as bodies on the move. Therefore, it becomes a thing that that is already proactive in some kind of way. And I guess the function of the word ontology there, it's quite productive and an interesting, deployment of phrasing, I guess.
Yeah, I see Kwaito as a space in which certain kinds of knowledge epistemes and in ways of being are being articulated. And so I think that's kind of, I mean, I didn't really explore it with any depth. I think initially, of course, the sun would come out right now. I hope y'all can see me okay, but I think initially I had thought about Kwaito as an ethics almost, right? And I had tried to kind of develop that, and I was working with my committee members. It ended up not going anywhere, but I think it came back in this sort of notion of ontology or a way of being, right? And so I mean, one of the things that I was struck by in my study of South African languages, right? And I study isiZulu, but I also studied Sesotho as well. But it was this way that you could change things, right? And turn them into that it seemed like that every kind of noun had a verb that went along with it, right? If you changed it, it would give you this meaning, right? To cause to learn, right? Or something like that is the sort of literal translation of teaching, right? So I really kind of think about these things as, and I guess that's what I wanted. I wanted a performative book, right? I wanted to think about Kwaito as this thing that was living and moving and bouncing and breathing and swaying and all of these things. And I guess for me, that idea of doing, right? And so the verb, the sort of verb aspects of the work, I hope that came across because I really wanted to sort of give a sort of performative dimension, right, to the text and the writing. Sorry, I'm gonna try to close this.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I don't know how we're doing with time.
You're doing well. You can go to Q&A now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. How do I do that?
Okay, so there were two comments from Andile. I don't know if you want to give that person a chance to. Andile, do you want to unmute yourself and speak through your question, or should Vusi read it?
I mean,
if you want to read it out yourself, please feel free to just immediately unmute. Okay, Andile Shai, can you see it, Vusi, from your side?
Andile says, yeah.
They can't unmute themselves, so we'll have to read it out. Do you want to read it out, Vusi?
That's the thing, I can't see anything. So if you don't mind.
Okay, I actually can see the question. So if you want me to, I can read it out.
Please read it out. And...
Okay, so this comment question from Andile, it says, following up on Vusi's remark earlier on Josie being sort of over-researched around topics that are deemed sensitive in certain spaces, especially in the African continent. How can we overcome the challenges one is likely to face when trying to recruit interlocutors for similar projects in smaller town and communities? What advice can you offer to someone who's trying to access Black queers in more remote communities? Because I think that they also have interesting narratives to share about their journey. So yeah, I think I don't know if I have like a specific answer to that, but I've always felt that in ethnographic practice, I do think that engaging in a kind of ethnographic practice in which the community knows that you're kind of there for the long haul in a certain kind of way, I think especially when you're outside the urban areas and you're kind of in smaller communities, I think is really important. I think if you sort of give off the vibe that you're coming there, whatever your intentions are and how self-reflexive and self-critical you are in your work, I think that if you do the thing of coming into the community and then sort of disappearing, once you've kind of, done your research project, I think that you have to think about the establishment of relationships that are with the community that are somewhat ongoing. And I think that the other thing I would say is that, in some of this sort of more activist anthropology, a lot of it is also about making sure that you as a researcher are, I think that the community can see some sort of redounded benefits to the work in some ways. That's the way, if that's the best way that I can say it, right? Because either the work is making some kind of policy recommendation or it's gesturing toward trying to create some kind of social change, right? I think if people can feel that their discussions with you are going to contribute to something, right? Or that there's some sort of long-lasting relationship, or frankly, that they're getting something out of the research, right? So even if it's a thing where you're offering tutoring or you're doing something that's also helping the community as you're also gathering the research, I think that those are ways that you can kind of think about access and so forth. And I think that some of those questions might also have to be thought about in relationship to, the ways that I think people might refuse certain notions of access and like don't want to be studied and don't want to be, included in academic research. And I think that has to be respected as well. So I hope that I got back to, to both of those elements in the question.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone has any questions, just unmute yourself. But yeah, can we just add on the chat? Just from the chat. Cool.
Okay, I'll ask one so long whilst we're waiting for someone. In some ways, you've already addressed it, Xavier, and thank you so much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, yeah, thank you so much. It's really a beautiful book. I just wanted to show this is how much I underline so much. And I'm actually prescribing 2 chapters for my course next semester. So I think just not of course in the book, but I think in so many of your other works you've produced various concepts that help us to not just think about, I think, various aspects of lives for South Africans, particularly at the margin, right? So terms like usable traditions, livable spaces, usable spaces, and so on. And I think all of them, in some ways, always complicate what we often think of as a one-way process, and often get us to think about things in new ways. And I think one of the most interesting chapters for me, I think, was chapter number 2, where you talk about the Boom Shaka incident, where they were performing Nkosi Sikelela. And I just wanted to just read one paragraph from the book where you say that Boom Shaka's performance of Nkosi is simply one example of how Kwaito bodies cannot be contained by the national script of Black heterosexual redemption. Significantly, Kwaito bodies become illegible if national belonging is defined by purity and an implicit autochthony. Okay, I can't pronounce that word. In both pre and post apartheid guises, you say Kwaito performers engage, extract, and create their musical practices from a complex array of Afro-diasporic entanglements. Several aspects of Boom Shaka's performance of Nkosi could be said to draw on forms of global circulating Afro-diasporic practices. 4 of the aspects of performance you go on to examine, which is first of all the dancing of the group, which was perceived to be very erotic. The raga chanting of Junior, for instance, in the group, which we used to think about Afro-diasporic space and so on. The backing house track of the song, which really is a form of remastering and rethinking the composition of Ngozi itself, but also mirrors forms of which we shall overcome. I guess my question is, so it was linked to this idea of just, I think one of the things also that was a aha for me is the ways in which you talk about how the black body in South Africa is often only useful when it's for political terms or some political uses, right? But it's always in some ways pushed to containment as soon as it involves issues of the erotica and so on. And there's a lovely term you used that I forgot. Oh yeah, erotically charged bodies. And so my question was really around the how you, I think so much of the tension in the book is around how, of course, this is a pleasurable experience for young people going out, dancing, the sensuality of it all, sometimes the sexuality of it all. But also, I do think you show how, in many ways, it's a critique of various forms of sort of, like you said, in one instance, black, for instance, patriarchal forms, but also a critique of sort of neoliberal policies, post-apartheid. But it's also in tension with, many ways, for instance, groups like Boom Shaka being able to make so much money because they own their rent. So I guess my question was around both us starting to really see these bodies as really engage in pleasurable practices, but also the tensions of, I guess this is what Vusi was linking to, around the constraints, right, as well, which is, of course, all of these neoliberal policies, how much of it is remastered versus stolen, so the Beyonce dancers example and so on. And I hope that makes sense because I'm talking way too much.
No, thank you. I wrote down a lot. I appreciate the way that you laid that out because, I mean, as I said, I really enjoy having these conversations because it teaches me about my own work and helps me to see the work in ways that just crystallize things really, really beautifully. Yeah, I think I just would say that, you know, I was always trying to work with contradiction, right, and tensions, and I feel like so much of cultural criticism seems to sort of suggest that Black people can't live with contradiction, which I think is interesting because I feel like our very experience requires us to constantly live with contradiction. And so, you know, if we're living with, you know, all of these contradictions of like being in a place that's enormously wealthy and yet most of the people around us are poor, right? I mean, you know, being in, you know, in our, you know, in our own spaces, but then knowing that that's kind of controlled by other people, like these are contradictory experiences that we've kind of always had to live with. And I think that I wanted to, and I guess this gets a bit back to remastery as well, but I wanted to think about those plausibilities and possibilities and the limits in which they occur. And I think that paragraph that you sort of pulled out really really speaks to that. And I try to also kind of talk about it with the understanding that that in some cases for the artists, they were just having fun or being provocative, right? And maybe didn't see what they were doing as, you know, as making any particular kind of commentary. But for me, it was kind of, I wanted to be able to, I guess, talk about certain things without being bogged down by notions of intentionality and intent. So yeah, I appreciate the comment, and I found it really generative for thinking about that particular framework. Yeah, thank you.
I guess I wanted to ask in relation to my own interest, my own practice as well as also just thinking about, you know, engaging in this kind of cultural art form that lives, right? And then having arrived at a time of arguably its peak, right? And then staying for quite a while, you know, engaging in sort of ethnographic study. Then how do you, at what point You know, at what point do you say, okay, now Vusu, this is enough, you know? Because this is, I mean, I get that people often speak about this cultural form as a thing of the past, but it actually lives, right? So when you decide that, you know, yeah, no, this is enough, I think I've gathered enough, you know, because this thing is not dead, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I would say two things. One, at some point the research has to stop, right? You know, and but it doesn't either, right? I mean, you can, let me say this, at some point the writing needs to be bracketed off at some point. The research can actually continue, right? You can continue doing the research until you're, you know, you're dead, basically, if that's what you want to do, right? But for the purposes of kind of writing an article or writing something down, I think, and that's I think in all formats of writing, both academic, non-academic, so forth, right? There's a point where you have to bracket something off, right? And so one of the things I tried to do was think about this text thematically rather than chronologically. And then I also tried to think about tried to think about how I could start someplace and bring us back, right? Maybe to that place again, right? Through the chapter, so that you kind of almost come back around to it. But I but honestly, I think at some point I mean, I did most of the research that was basically to become the book in the aughts, right? And but like any kind of ethnographic practice, it's kind of never ending. And so, you know, I mean, if you're genuinely establishing relationships with people, right, you know, and communities, then it goes on, right? It has a life of its own that sort of exceeds whatever you're trying to do with your scholarship and academic work. And so I went to I think I finally stopped, you know, maybe around 2015 or so, I would say, as far as like any new information. Now, if there was something that happened that was very galvanizing, I had to include that. So for example, you know, the Lebo Matosa chapter had to be rewritten because she passed, you know, and then so did the Mendoza chapter. And I just thought, is everyone going to pass away that I'm writing about, right? This isn't what I expected. And so those were things I had to, you know, reconsider, right? How to talk about folks who weren't around to speak for themselves any longer. It's like, even if I wanted to interview them, you know, which I probably would have tried to maybe do a little bit later, right? I couldn't any longer, right? So I had to, you know, so I had to consider, you know, I had to consider some of those things. But I think what I tried to do was to kind of say, okay, for the most part, the research is the time period I spent living in Johannesburg, right? But in order to update things and to keep things sort of fresh and relevant, you know, I would have to add things that happened afterwards. But I would say a lot of that was not like, now I'm going out into the field, right? You know, a lot of that was more like just, you know, the experiences that I was having with people. So, I mean, a little bit of really serious, deep hanging out, I would argue, right? To take that kind of old term that I think has become somewhat passe now in cultural studies, but I kind of found it really generative, right? It was a lot of, you know, deep hanging out rather than kind of a sense of like, okay, now I'm in the field and now I'm not, right? And particularly, you know, part of this research also spanned immense changes in technologies, right? So a lot of it was also that there was so much more I could do from my home, right? It didn't actually require me to get on a plane, because there were things that I could kind of get through social media, and I could talk to people way easier, you know, like I don't know what I did before WhatsApp happened, you know, was invented. You know, I remember I used to get those little calling cards um, in order to call and talk to people in South Africa. So I think that's what I would just say, you know, about that, is just that, you know, at some point you have to sit down and write. And so at some point I just had to say, okay, anything that I do now is limited specifically to updating something around the ideas that I've engaged, but I cannot keep doing this research, right? Because it could just keep going, right? And I think that speaks to some of the larger challenges of doing cultural studies work with kind of living, breathing art forms and practices, right? Because you have to, which is why I tell people, think about these things maybe in relation to the social and in relation to thematics, because a lot of the social and thematic stuff will remain constant even as the culture changes, if that makes any sense. I think Kakiso has a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have a question. And I think it's going to take a while for me to get to this question, but I'm going to focus on it a bit. By the way, thanks, Vusi, for that. I haven't read the text, but I've engaged with Xavier's work, especially on queer space making, so in the night time. So I was teaching a course on city life and nighttime, at Wits, and I happened to come across your work, and I've been very interested, and I'm very excited to read this book. So I'm doing research also. I'm doing my doctoral work on sort of like Black life and happiness, sort of like how people think about their own lives subjectively and what happiness means for them. And I think I'm really interested in the concept of Kwaito bodies, especially as a side of sort of like Black resistance and defiance, to a system that's very, very oppressive to them, right? So sort of like where they meet as spaces of collective as well as cautious defiance, right, to a system that they sort of like exist in. And I was wondering if that was your thinking again in terms of penning this down, thinking not only about art as resistance, but spaces of resistance, bodies of resistance, embodying, Kwaito as a way of resistance, having fun, through different modes, of course, as resistance to given structural issues that people face in their everyday. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yes, I mean, so I think that, it gets, for me, this focus on, and I like the idea of the study of happiness. I'm looking forward to reading about that, definitely. But I think that your idea to focus on happiness, and I think my idea to kind of focus on notions of joy and pleasure, I think it connects to this, question that I always had about, in a South African context, who, and I hate to use this bodies terminology, but which bodies are afforded, being represented as pleasurable and as engaging in pleasure and joy, and which ones are kind of just, overrepresented as being, I don't know, in pain, death, loss, right? And so I think for me, it was really important to situate how the taking of pleasure and engagement with that becomes political in very important ways. But when I think about resistance, I did try to kind of, I wanted to be careful, and I think that's why I tried to kind of think about it as a contested, and I think that's why I use disidentification as well a lot, because I talk a lot about, in Munoz's concept, he wants to think about, those moments that kind of function somewhat in between the resistance and sort of co-optation binary, so that things are either kind of represented as being a space of resistance, and then here's the resistance, right? Or that these things are sort of represented as being spaces of co-optation to, let's say, the capitalist neoliberal order, right? And Munoz wanted to talk about those ways, particularly that queers of color in the U.S. context kind of had to kind of navigate in between. And I think this thought for me. So so for me, I saw Kwaito as doing that, and I saw that the gestures, like not everything was completely resistant, right? There was a lot of going along with, you know, certain logics as well, right? But I wanted to talk about that in between space, right? Of gestures and moments that are resistant, and gestures and moments that are maybe not so resistant, right? And also to think about how they can be interpreted simultaneously as such, right? Like a moment in a performance could actually gesture to both of these things simultaneously, right? And that's what I was trying to kind of get at in the text, is to try to push us towards these sort of nuanced frameworks and nuanced meanings. So I was asked at one time when I gave really preliminary versions of this work about notions of continuity and discontinuity, right? And I basically had to come up and say to the person, well, actually, I think both are operative at the same time, right? So like something that, you know, so if we look at someone like Lebo Mathosa, like she is engaging in certain kinds of dance idioms that come directly from certain kinds of sociocultural traditions, right? And so, yeah, continuity, right? But then she's also doing that oftentimes outside of these sort of prescribed frameworks of, like, you know, a person from this cultural group dances their own cultural dances and doesn't dance the cultural dances of other people, right? And then and so I talked about that as an example of how that very same engagement, right, with these sort of dance idioms are both simultaneously an example of continuity and discontinuity, right? And then even when you think about the other kinds of dances that she incorporates that are not rooted in South Africa, that may at first glance be considered to be discontinuous, right, or a form of discontinuity, but it actually also embeds itself in a longer tradition of certain kinds of borrowings, right, and engagements with the other parts of the world that Black South Africans have been engaged with. So in that way, it's a continuity, right? And so I think that I tried to kind of also read resistance in that same way and try to kind of think about it as Kwaito as a kind of in-between space for the negotiation of these questions of co-optation and resistance. Yeah, I hope that made sense. Sorry, I feel like I rambled there.
Yeah, I wanted to just throw one more in. I believe we're nearing the end of the discussion. But I was just thinking about what you're saying now, and whether you'd situate your interrogation of, you know, or I guess your accusation of cultural imperialism as far as Beyonce's, you know, practice and collaboration, if we may call it that, with the with the dancers that have been featured in her in a video. Do you think in any way those are moments of, I mean, at first glance, I did check when I was reading, I did check the video. I think you mentioned the video where she meets them in this, you know, a dance hall, and then they don't know who she is, and you know, and you say maybe that could have been possibly staged. But anyways, I'm interested in how, whether we could think about it as, oh, she's giving these, you know, these cats some nod and just giving them some space and platform at a global stage, but at the same time there's this exploitative thing going on, right? Where you don't know if, you know, had they just went through without them, would they possibly would have been credited and whatever, you know. Then how do you think about this sort of within the context of you know, the Afro diaspora, right? How do we then think about, how do we negotiate the tension between, you know, this form of solidarity in the form of assistance, right, and providing a platform, and that tension against, you know, the possible exploitation that is quite, you know, quite problematic in terms of how the Black American, community tends to, at least in the celebrity sense, tends to deal with and negotiate with the continent in quite problematic ways. Maybe we've seen in cinema, in pop culture, but how do we think about that tension? Can also think of it as a moment of discontinuities and continuities as far as these entanglements that take place within the Afro-diasporic space.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think Afro-diasporic space is about a simultaneous continuity and discontinuity. It's about misrecognition, right? The simultaneous recognition and lack of recognition, or misrecognition. And so I think I tried to leave that reading and interpretation very open, right? Because I wanted to say, and I don't know if I would have wrote it differently post Lemonade, right? Like, I was trying to decide, do I want to go back and kind of rethink this? Because, as I'm sure some of you are well aware, there's like an artist collective in New Orleans who felt like that entire Lemonade project was stolen from them, right? And that they had no real, literally, they said Beyonce is literally a corporation, right? So we can't fight back against her. Like, we don't have the resources to kind of make these claims. And of course, I think a couple things like, so I don't know if I would do it differently, but what I was trying to get at, I think exactly was that, if we want to say Black American celebrity, but I think Black Americans are in this really interesting position of kind of just really having no way out, right? Because in one way you're in the middle of empire and you're a victim of empire in very particular kinds of ways, right? But because you are embedded in the center of that empire, there's also always this sort of overrepresentation of your forms of Blackness, right? As kind of global forms of Blackness, right? And I think that there oftentimes in diasporic conversations are confusions about hypervisibility meaning empowerment, right? And it doesn't mean that, right? Or hypercirculation by an American capitalist music and movie industry, right? Doesn't necessarily mean empowerment for those people from whom it. And so I think I wanted to. So, I think at this point I'll just plug, Masharia's book, Frottage, right? Because I think I was kind of thinking about that, even though I didn't have the language of friction or frottage to think about, this thing that can be both irritating but potentially pleasurable, right? That's sort of rubbing up against that can at some moments be an irritation, and at other moments can be, a sign of certain kinds of pleasure and joy, right? And I think that part of what I would just say is that, you don't argue with people that you don't care about or love, right? I mean, like, if you really just don't care, you kind of just walk away from it, right? So I think that some of these tensions speak to what I was trying to get at around the contradictions and the forms of irreconcilability, but also the forms of possibility that exist there, right? And so in that reading, I tried to make space for both the kind of more traditionally, material analysis that would kind of read this through a kind of very Marxist kind of economic lens, right? And kind of see these dancers as sort of exploited labor, right? But also to think about it as, I think Beyonce, like a lot of Black Americans, right, has tried to kind of make some kind of sincere efforts at connection, with the African continent, and collaboration. And I think she's way better now if we think about her latest projects, right, than she was maybe at the time I was writing. So I think that's what I would say, is that it was a way of, my reading was an effort to try to read both those desires for a certain kind of possibility of solidarity and cooperation and collaboration, as well as understanding that, people are not meeting as equals within that, right? And that in this case, she had more capital, frankly, if we want to use whether social, political, or economic.
I think I saw, was it a comment from you, but I don't know. I saw something from you.
Yes.
Was it private?
Pardon?
Was it private?
No, it was private, but it was a timekeeping issue. I was saying, unless there are any burning comments, I think you should close us off both yourself. But unless there's quite a burning comment, because I can see because of the time people are needing to leave.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have any other further things to say now. But yeah, I mean, if anyone else has any questions for Xavier.
Oh, and Xavier has been kind enough to provide his email in the chat box, so you can get it there if anyone wants to connect further. Do you want to say something? Okay, I think Vusi and Xavier, you can just give closing comments, and then we will wrap up.
Cool. I mean, I can go first. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, and firstly, it was just great to see you again, Prof. It's been what, months since we last spoke. So it was nice to see you. It was nice to go through the work and just think about some of my initial thoughts, and how some of them went back and just gave some thought as well. It's also part of the process of the process of learning, but also the process of of critically engaging with the work. But I think it's a beautiful project, and it has personally given me quite a lot. The level of ideas, concepts that I think are quite useful, and that's all for me. Grateful for this. Thank you to Obani.
So I'll just close off by saying that, you oftentimes do a lot of this writing on your own, and you're kind of isolated. You're just kind of doing the writing, and you're not sure how people are going to take up the work, and how they're going to engage the work. So I don't take these kinds of fora for granted, and so I really appreciate everyone being here, the questions, the engagement, and I will say that y'all are really the first kind of audience in South Africa that I've been able to really talk about with the book about. So I was just really excited to have that opportunity to actually start engaging with South Africans about this text, and I hope there'll be more of those opportunities, and hopefully maybe in person someday. But in the meantime, I just want to, thank everyone for reading and engaging the work. I really appreciate it. And I know that some people have expressed concerns about the availability of the text in South Africa, and I'm working on that right now. I'm trying to see if I can actually get a local press to publish it. So we'll see how that goes.
Lovely. I think the last comments from Julia and Rowan sum up everything, which is thank you, Xavier and Vusi. Brilliant conversation. And certainly my friend who's here with me can't stop raving about both your moderation, Vusi, but certainly your contribution, Xavier. So thank you so much to you both. It's been a really beautiful afternoon. We nearly went to 2 hours. It's amazing how quickly the time flew. And absolutely, yes. I think when we can all gather safely, I think these conversations deserve to be had. Certainly in person. I think the dynamic completely also shifts. So thank you to you both. Everyone have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cool.
Thank you, Prof.
I don't know how to sign.